Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Manisha and today I'll be reviewing the film Rear Window. We are going to analyse this film and explore its intricacies as we apply a masculine lens. What's important to understand is that masculinity is complex and there is no one right or wrong answer on the definition of masculinity. Masculinity is very much influenced by society and there does exist a relationship between the individual and the community. Rear Window, released in 1954, is a film that not only understands the voyeuristic nature of film as a medium, but incites discourse of the relationship voyeurism has with masculinity. Albie Jeffries, the protagonist, becomes bound to a wheelchair after an accident and spends his time supposedly innocently observing the behaviours of his neighbours. As the film progresses, various assumptions are made about each neighbour. The viewer is encouraged to participate in Albie Jeffries' voyeuristic behaviour as he spends the film watching the actions of his neighbours. Seeing Jeff as a peeping Tom is to see oneself as a peeping Tom, as we end up equally guilty of spying on his neighbours as he is. Alfred Hitchcock, director of the film, famous for his limited camera angle perspectives, provides an insight into the flawed masculine ideals as mimicked by Jeff's flawed behaviour and appearance. Hitchcock touches on a variety of masculinities, predominantly appeared to be flawed, through its protagonist Albie Jeffries. Jeff's perspective and male gaze allowed males a measure of control that denies the perspectives of other women such as Lisa and Stella in the film. Overall, the film provides a social commentary on McCarthyism. It is unlike many other 1950s films which held stereotypical masculine ideals, but rather challenges the gender roles. Nonetheless, Hitchcock's presentation of the males in the film still ultimately positions them superior over the women. Masculinity is portrayed and idealized rather than critiqued of its notion itself. Now let's look at the masculine narrative. The nature of voyeurism stems from the male gaze. This objectifies women and empowers men in return. All the men in the film, including Albie Jeffries, Doyle, and Lars Thorwald, are heterosexual white males. As you can see in the slide, we have Doyle on the top right, Albie Jeffries in the middle, and Lars Thorwald on the bottom right. Coloured men were not common in American 1950s media, and its audience was intended to be for straight, white, and heterosexual American men. Their heterosexuality formed their masculine identities, as noted by Diane Richardson in 2010, as they humour feminine behaviours. It only re-emphasises the hegemony of patriarchy. As can be seen, both Doyle and Thorwald are depicted in suits which emphasize their masculinity and highlight their business-like appearance. However, Hitchcock does challenge 1950s construct of normative masculinity as he depicts Albie Jeffries as disabled in a wheelchair. His movement is impaired and he is constrained to the four walls of his apartment in Greenwich, New York. The cast on his broken leg signifies a phallic symbol which diminishes his masculinity. As Modelsky from The Women Who Knew Too Much writes, Jeff's cast is a phallic symbol, long, stiff, and jutting from the body, yet the cast also signifies that something is broken, weak. It is a physical impotence, but also a sexual one. Towards the end of the film, Jeff is further impaired with both his legs in a cast. This further re-emphasizes the digression of his masculinity as the film pursues. Albie Jeffries' camera lens is also a phallic symbol, which we can see pointing and jutting out into things he shouldn't be doing. This presents his masculinity as broken and flawed compared to the other male characters, who better adhere themselves to the stereotypical masculine tropes. The private-public gender norms are reversed in this film, as Lisa goes to work and comes home. Her and Stella are Jeff's primary caretakers. It is Lisa who ventures out of the domestic sphere to earn money and live independently. The subversion of gender norms is questioned by Hitchcock in the film. Lisa links her sexual assertiveness to her professional identity in the public sphere, which Jeff's disability prevented him from being at. The 1950s also saw a rise of women in the workforce and represented women's liberation outside of their home environment. There was both an increase in female sexuality and women entering the paid workforce. Women were starting to emulate men's behaviours which threatened the normative societal hierarchy. Albie Jeffries becomes afraid of Lisa's assertiveness and belittles the knowledge both her and Stella have to share. For example, when Stella insisted she predicted the 1929 stock market crash in the film, Jeff simply dismisses her observation as one which is irrational and a feminine trait. The male stereotypes of being over-analytical and reluctance to marriage are stereotypical of the 1950s man. The reluctance to marriage rejected the idea of wanting a 1950s nuclear family, further re-emphasizes Jeff's social values, yet rather than encouraging the audience to be like this, Hitchcock provides a critique of it. The hierarchies of the film are largely challenged as the protagonist is disabled and bounded to his wheelchair, which pokes at his masculinity. Lisa seems to hold the power in the film as she is independent, works a full-time job, and is able to travel both inside and outside the house, unlike Jeff. There are many instances where the mise-en-scene presents Lisa as above Jeff, and as we can see physically and through imagery, that Lisa does hold a more dominant position over Jeff. It can also be seen when she says, "I was all morning in a sales meeting and then I had to go to 21 to have lunch with Harper Bazaar's people, and that's when I ordered dinner. Then I had 2 full showings 20 blocks apart." Her business and active role in the film contrasts and accentuates Jeff's meager and weak stance. His cast, which reads, "Here lies the broken bones of L.B. Jeffries," depicts an epitaph on a headstone, which emphasizes his weakness and lack of dominance. This role subversion is another example of an atypical relationship which does not conform to gender norms of the 1950s. Hegemonic masculinity is a concept which underscores the most rewarded form of masculinity that legitimizes patriarchal relations. It supports the idea that masculine superiority is entrenched in our systems, which create large discrepancies for inequality and power imbalances. It is the opposite of femininity and draws on being competitive, strong, and independent. This can be applied to Rear Window as the men continue to reject femininity. For example, when Doyle enters the apartment as Lisa hums, he makes a contorted face, indicating his judgment of her femininity and his rejection of it as well. While there is a subversion of gender norms, the film ultimately depicts men who have the overarching power over women. Lisa still seeks for Jeff's approval and goes along with his ploys to prove Lars Thorwald has murdered his wife. However, while he is still bound to his wheelchair, it is his words which hold power over Lisa. The men in the film also objectify women. Both Doyle and Jeff can be seen eyeing Miss Torso when she changes in and out of her dresses. This is typical of the behavior of a 1950s male and is quite normalized during this era. Now let's touch on intersectionality. Now, this is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, which highlights the combining factors of different facets in an individual which can either lead to their advantage or disadvantage in a particular societal setting. The intersections of their race, class, and sexual orientation supports the privileged men like Doyle and Jeff receive. It is unclear, but can only be assumed that a homosexual male or colored male will in no way be portrayed in a powerful light in the 1950s American media. This privilege was probably not so obvious in 1950s America due to the normality of the lack of diverse races and representations of different sexual orientation. Our value systems have much evolved, and from a 2022 lens, it is quite clear that Hitchcock only included men who are already quite privileged. This film then inadvertently excluded men of color and a different sexual orientation. We know that masculinity often changes, and its dominance is actually reignited when a crisis occurs. World War II allowed for men to feel like they were the nation's protectors. But now in the 1950s, the new responsibilities of being at home and at work did not seem to satisfy their masculine ideals. Jeff is a returning soldier, which can be noted when Doyle reminds us of them being in a plane for 3 years during the war. He is stuck at home and figuratively castrated as he has become some version of the stay-at-home wife himself. This highlighted the crisis of his masculinity, especially when it is the women in the film who are taking care of him and he has no physical capacity. One really important thing to note is that this film was actually brought about during the McCarthy era. And McCarthyism is an era which occurred when Joseph McCarthy, an American politician, accused innocent people of being communist and Soviet spies which have infiltrated the American institutions. The false accusations led to innocent convictions. Hitchcock purposefully employed Jeff, a straight white male, as his protagonist who performed such actions and created accusations, although not obvious if false or not. The over-analysis and becoming the peeping Tom is what he condemns and provides social commentary on. This is quite obvious when at the end, after his whole escapade and falling off the window, he actually ends up breaking another one of his legs, another phallic symbol and something else which diminishes his masculinity. His primary audience was for white male Americans in the 1950s. He challenges them about the gender norms occurring in the 1950s while warning them of the dangers of becoming too involved in people's lives. I really hope you all enjoyed that short presentation. Hitchcock's social commentary on Rear Window provided a very interesting take on masculinity as he showcased many different characters. It also gives us, the viewers of the 21st century, an insight into the historical relevance of American media in provoking its audience's thoughts of the gender binary and masculine stereotypes. Thank you so much for listening.